Standing by a purpose true, heeding God's command. Honor then the faithful few, all hail to Daniel's band. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known.
Our study in the book of Daniel. I hope you are all able to see the spiritual context and its value for our understanding of the book of Daniel. Understanding the book of Daniel is definitely a great challenge. A study that we can do only with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, who inspired Bible writers like Daniel and other prophets. And especially for understanding these prophecies, which are apocalyptic in nature, which point us to the end times in which we are living. And not only to see the details and their interpretations, but to see what is happening behind the curtains, the great controversy that we see taking place. Understanding the spiritual context would help us to emulate the message that we will receive from the book of Daniel, see the importance of the prophecies and their accurate fulfillment in history, because history is in God's hands. It is God who is the author and finisher of our faith. It is in his hands he holds the universe, as he could see the end from the beginning. We thank God for this wonderful revelation through his servant Daniel, and for the special understanding that God has given us, his church, God's people, through centuries, who have studied the book of Daniel and given for us wonderful principles by which we are studying and understanding this book. This is not only unique to the small group of us or a larger church maybe that we meet, but these are principles that would guide us in a proper and better understanding of the Word of God. Last week we studied about the prophecy in chapter 7. This parallel to chapter 2 of the dream that God gave to the heathen king Nebuchadnezzar, revealing to him the history of the world symbolically through the multi-metal image, each part of the body representing various nations of the world, each metal representing various kingdoms. Head of gold, Babylon; chest and arms of silver, Medo-Persia; belly and thighs of Greece; legs of iron, Rome; feet and toes of iron and clay, the 10 divided kingdoms; and then God's kingdom represented by the stone. And in chapter 7, we saw the 4 great beasts. The first which looked like a lion, the second which looked like a bear, the third which looked like a leopard, and fourth which looked like a terrible beast, a nondescript beast. Daniel could find no living animal to symbolize, to name this fourth beast. And then we saw the little horn and its activities against God's people. And then we saw judgment. And as you're looking at these apocalyptic prophecies, we could see this telescopic vision. First, in chapter 2, we saw broad strokes of history, the political history of this world, from the time of Daniel till the very end. In chapter 7, we saw the same history in parallel, but with added details. In chapter 7, the little horn and its activities, this enemy of God, persecuting God's people, speaking words against the Most High, trying to change times and laws. And as it's carrying on its activities, judgment takes place and brings this little horn and its power and activities to an end, and God's people receive the kingdom. In chapter 8, we will see even more minutely the activities of the little horn. We see similar history. There are parallels between Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8. These are all parallels. But you see greater and more finer details coming through in this vision of chapter 8. We ask God's special blessing today as we may be able to see this wonderful and more clearer picture emerging. Now, the great controversy, it's the same players once again. The little horn, which carried on its activities against God's people in chapter 7, we see now carrying on its activities, especially against the sanctuary. Against the sanctuary. And this is very clearly depicted in chapter 8, as we will see today. As we begin chapter 8, we see a change in language. Daniel begins chapter 2 in chapter 1 in the Hebrew language. And in chapter 2, verse 4, part B, second part of verse 4, he switches to Aramaic language as he hears the conversation in Aramaic, the language of Babylon, and continues on till the end of chapter 7. And now in chapter 8, it changes back to Aramaic. And from 8 onwards till the very end, he continues on in the Aramaic language, in the Hebrew language. Back to Hebrew language, back to the sanctuary. Focus is undoubtedly upon God's people and the temple activity. In chapter 7, the animals we saw were wild animals. But in chapter 8, we will see domestic animals. This is in contrast to the wild animals symbolizing political powers and political nature. But these domestic animals, these sanctuary animals, showing religious powers, religious aspects to this controversy that we will identify. In Daniel 7, we saw the attention upon judgment and the little horn and its activities. But we see in chapter 8 some aspects of the vision of chapter 7 missing. I want you to be prepared. It is not an exact parallel, while it is, but in chapter 8, we see there are certain parts missing, and be prepared to see this. But the major theme in the book of Daniel, judgment, is now more closely presented in the sanctuary and in the sanctuary service, especially of the Jewish Day of Atonement. So with this brief introduction, we will now enter into the text of Daniel chapter 8. Shall we? If you have your Bibles, I invite you to please turn into Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Daniel sets us the context. It was the reign of Belshazzar. He was taken up in a vision. He was looking, but he seemed to have been transported to Shushan, the capital of the Persian Empire. And in this province of Elam, he was by the river Ulai. So he is certain where he is, even in terms of his position, though it was a vision. And if you see in this second verse, I was looking, I saw. Daniel is certain that this was something that he saw, a vision. He had no question about what he saw because he clearly mentions that he saw, undoubtedly. And there, as he was by this river, as he saw, there was a ram which had two horns, and these horns were high, showing that these are strong political powers. But you could see how one horn was higher than the other. What does this remind us of? In chapter 7, the second beast, bear, had one shoulder higher than the other. The second world power, Medo-Persia, was composed of the Medes and the Persians. But the later, which came, was higher, and that is the Persians. This ram of chapter 8 is parallel to the bear of chapter 7. And he saw that this ram was pushing to the west and to the east and to the glorious land. This ram was moving in horizontal directions. It was going westward, northward, and southward. That's what the Persians did. As they went conquering, they conquered Egypt in the south, they conquered Syria in the east, and they conquered Lydia towards the west, and other powers in the European world. And it was so great that no animal was able to hold it, and it did as it willed. So this vision in chapter 8 begins with the Persian power, the second power. So Babylon is missing. As I told you, be prepared to see something missing. Babylon is missing in this vision. This vision begins with the ram, which represents Medo-Persia. And verse 5, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west. Daniel is very certain, he's very clear and specific. He saw a goat, a second animal, a second sanctuary animal. Ram and goats are used for sacrifices in the sanctuary. And now this goat was coming from the west. It was coming with such great speed that it was not even touching the ground, but virtually flying in the air. And interestingly, this goat had a notable horn between its eyes. While it had its two horns, and usually the goat's horns are curved inward, but there it had between its eyes a notable horn. And it came near the ram, and it confronted the ram. And there was such a great rage and a war, as it were, broke between these two animals. And finally, the ram was attacked and defeated because it could not stand the goat. But then in the process, the he-goat lost its notable horn. And nobody could stand this. As his horn grew, as his male goat grew, the large horn was broken, verse 8, and in its place, four notable horns came up towards the four winds of heaven. Four horns came in place of that single horn. And we know prophetically, so far in the parallels of the two visions of chapter 2 and 7, the power that followed the Medo-Persians or the Greeks. The Greek Empire was established by Alexander the Great, conquered the world in a short time. Having conquered the world, Alexander died very young. But after him, history tells us that his empire was divided into four parts by his generals. And thus, this power gradually declined, giving way to the next power. Verse 9, this is very crucial. I want you to note very carefully. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and towards the glorious land. It looks like in this vision, there is something else missing. The little horn power comes a bit too early. After the Grecian power, as we know, there is a fourth power represented by the legs in chapter 2, by the terrible beast in chapter 7. And this power, we know, was Rome. In this vision of chapter 8, Roman power is also missing. But then comes the little horn, and it moves towards the south and the east and the glorious land. This little horn appears a little early, as I said. The Roman power is missing, keep that in mind. But about the rise of the little horn, as you read verse 9, most scholars and most Christians take this, that the little horn rose out of one of the four horns because of its proximity and similarity to the four horns. Where can a horn come from? Another horn, like the notable horn on the Grecian goat. When it was broken, four horns came in its place. Likewise, they conclude that this little horn comes out of one of the four horns. This is most unlikely interpretation. Because of its proximity and its similarities, the little horn is taken to be a Grecian power. We see this also in a couple of Bible verses I want to refer to. In Acts 24, verse 15, it reads, I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. There is a resurrection that is talked about here of the dead. But these are two different resurrections, as we know, of the just and the unjust. When will the just resurrect? At the second coming of Jesus, and the unjust at the third coming of Jesus. The just will receive the reward at the second coming. The unjust will receive their punishment at the third coming of Jesus. But they are spoken of almost in the same breath. Likewise, in John 5:28 and 29, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth, those who have done to the resurrection of life, and those who have done to the risen of condemnation. Parallel verse. To resurrection once again. Resurrection to life takes place at the second coming, and resurrection of condemnation takes place at the third coming. Yes, it appears that the resurrection of good and wicked take place at the same time because of the closeness of its mention. But when we study the scriptures, we know that the resurrection of the good and bad, righteous and unrighteous, take place separated by 1,000 years. Likewise, to understand the origin of the little horn in Daniel chapter 8, this prophecy, it is not to be taken as a Grecian power. But we know from chapter 7 that the little horn is a post-Roman power. It is a power that came after the imperial Rome. When imperial Rome took upon itself religious powers, turned to be a papal power, which followed the pagan Roman power, called by church historians as papacy. Thus, it exercised its power, as we saw in chapter 7, for a time and a half a times, or 1260 days. But unfortunately, most Christian scholars who follow the preterist and futurist school of interpretation of prophecy, who see the fulfillment of prophecy in the past or in the future, see no historical value to this prophecy. Thus, they apply the little horn power to a Syrian king named Antiochus Epiphanes, who is part of the 4 divided kingdoms of Alexander's empire, the Seleucid king who ruled in the 2nd century BC. What did he do? He desecrated Jerusalem temple by offering unclean animals, and he persecuted the Jews for a few years. But a correct understanding of the little horn power and its rise in the context, as we see in verse 9, little horn grew out of one of them, and this them grammatically and literarily cannot apply to one of the 4 horns, because one of them is male plural. It cannot apply to horns, which is a female plural, but can apply to the 4 winds, which is male or female plural. So therefore, the little horn grew out of one of the 4 winds, not one of the 4 horns. And we see these horizontal directions as it moved towards the south and the east and the glorious land. So its rise and its extension is from one of the 4 directions and not from one of the 4 horns. So it cannot be a Grecian power. It cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, a Grecian king, a Seleucid of the Seleucid dynasties, who ruled in the province of Syria in the 2nd century BC. This little horn power that we see here is to be very clearly identified, and I will summarize this even a little bit later. But this little horn power now, from verse 10 onwards, we see horizontally, like its activities against God's people, persecuting God's people, speaking against the Most High. Once again, verse 10, it grew up to the host of heaven. We see the little horn not only carrying on its activities horizontally, but vertically to the host of heaven. In verse 11, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host in heaven. And that is none other than Jesus Christ himself. We will see him in chapter 9 again as the Messiah Prince, or the Prince of the host. And it carries on its activities. Verse 11, he even exalts himself as high as the Prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. Its activities are now against the sanctuary, and the place of the sanctuary, and the daily sacrifices in the sanctuary. But where is this sanctuary now? What is the context in verse 10 and 11? The context is heaven. The little horn is not carrying on its activities against the sanctuary on this earth, but it is a sanctuary which is in heaven that we have to identify very, very clearly. So from verse 10 to 12, we see the activity of the little horn moving from earth to heaven. These activities that he is carrying on are against the host of heaven, the prince of the host, that is Jesus Christ. Here is now this attack on the sanctuary, but this sanctuary is not on this earth, but it is in heaven. The little horn is therefore carrying on its activities against Christ and his sanctuary and his ministry in the heavenly sanctuary as our mediator in the heavenly sanctuary. And as Daniel continued to hear, now he saw things, now he's hearing. There are two heavenly beings speaking to each other, saying, how long will this vision be? It says this vision is not only about the little horn and its activities, but it is about the power represented by the ram, Medo-Persia, and the he-goat, Greece, and then the little horn and its activities. All of these things are involved. This vision, which shall be about the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. These are activities that the little horn is carrying on against God, even in the heavenly places. Then the answer comes unto 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Immediately we can recognize that this is sanctuary language. Two key words. Firstly, the daily. The daily. And secondly, the cleansing, which refers to a very important Jewish festival. But to understand the activities in the heavenly sanctuary, we need to also know, to understand the heavenly sanctuary, we can know that through the earthly sanctuary. The daily refers to the events that took place in the sanctuary service. As you remember, the sanctuary service in the wilderness that Moses set up had sacrifices that were performed every day. The daily, the Hebrew word called tamid, is a key word that points us to the daily sacrifices or services carried on in the sanctuary, such as the morning and evening sacrifices, the continual burnt offerings. That means there was always fire burning on the altar. Then there was a bread of the Lord's presence. There was always bread that was kept in this sanctuary, and the lights were always trimmed and burning. And we know all of these things that happened in the outer court, in the altar of burnt offering, in the holy place, the bread of the Lord's presence, and the lampstand, and the sacrifices, the incense, all of these pointed to very clearly the ministry of Jesus Christ. All of these sacrifices and ceremonies that took place in the earthly sanctuary all pointed to Jesus. Very interestingly, we can see the animals that were sacrificed in the sanctuary pointed to Jesus. The priest, the high priest, all pointed to Jesus. The bread and the lights and the incense, the Ark of the Covenants, all represented Jesus Christ. Everything that happened in the sanctuary, earthly sanctuary, all pointed to Jesus Christ and his great atoning sacrifice. And then the cleansing of the sanctuary was an yearly ritual which took place on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which fell on the 10th day of the Jewish 7th month. On the 10th day of the 7th Jewish month, they celebrated the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was a day like a day of judgment for them. When the whole camp of Israel assembled around the sanctuary, two goats were selected, the Lord's goat and the scapegoat. And the Lord's goat, on which the lot fell, was sacrificed, and its blood was taken and sprinkled in the sanctuary. And so the sins that were accumulated in the sanctuary throughout the year were completely cleansed. And the blood that was sprinkled on the veil that separated the holy and the most holy place was removed and burned outside the camp. And the sanctuary was completely cleansed. Thus, symbolically, the sins, confessed sins of the whole camp of Israel was cleansed. Symbolically. And all this pointed to the great atonement that Christ was going to accomplish on the cross. So this cleansing of the sanctuary by Christ and his ministry is what is really under attack, as we will see in the sanctuary in this vision of chapter 8. The little horn is carrying on this great warfare. This agent of Satan is attacking now the ministry of Jesus directly as portrayed in this sanctuary service. And as Daniel saw all this activity, he hears this conversation and he was deeply interested. How long will this vision be? And in verse 14, the answer comes to him. For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Yes, this refers to the cleansing of the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement, which was like a day of judgment. And so to this time element about this judgment, as we apply year for a day principle that is used in the historicist school to interpret time prophecies in apocalyptic prophecies, the 2,300 years period refers to the time when the anti-typical Day of Atonement, or the ultimate reality of the Day of Atonement symbolized in the earthly sanctuary when it was cleansed took place, which is the Day of Judgment. This time period of 2,300 days, therefore, relates to judgment that is to take place. A judgment that the Bible tells us, Daniel 7 tells us, will take place before the little horn and its powers are brought to an end, and the righteous will be saved when Christ comes the second time. The pre-Advent judgment, which condemns the little horn, this persecuting power, and destroys it. And the saints who are persecuted are vindicated, and they will receive the kingdom of God. So this 2,300 days prophecy that we see in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, indicates the time of judgment. Since it is a pivot on the cleansing of the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement, the calculations of this prophecy, we will yet have to wait because we do not know the beginning date of this prophecy. The prophecy which is in chapter 8 concerning the activities of the little horn, concerning the Medo-Persian and Grecian powers. Chapter 9 tells us about this prophecy, and we will wait then to know about the time period that this prophecy spans, the 2,300 days. This prophecy, as we see, is very crucial, tells us about God's great work of judgment, and when this work of judgment is to begin, because once the judgment has begun, it will come to an end, and God's people will be saved. Those who have made the decision and choice for God. The identification of the little horn and its rise is very crucial to set the date of the Day of Judgment. As we have already said, this little horn in Daniel chapter 8 is not a Grecian power, as most biblical scholars would like to say, and see that this prophecy, this time period is not prophetic time period, but a historical time period. They see that this 2,300 days cleansing of the sanctuary or the daily sacrifices of morning and evening, what do they do with this? They take this time period to be 2,300 morning, evening sacrifices. Thus, they divide by 2 and come to 1,150 days. And they try to fit these 1,150 days to the desecration that Antiochus Epiphanes did in the 2nd century in Jerusalem to the temple. Unfortunately, these scholars miss the prophetic interpretation of time and also the activity of the little horn to what is happening in the heavenly sanctuary and not on the earthly sanctuary. This, therefore, is not an acceptable understanding. It is not biblical. The grammatical and contextual explanation only suggests that the little horn rose out of one of the 4 winds or one of the 4 directions, and it is a post-Roman power rising after the 4th beast and the 10 divided kingdoms. We can see some very valid reasons why Antiochus Epiphanes cannot be the little horn. We have seen the little horn in Daniel 7 comes after the 4th beast and among the 10 horns. But we cannot place it in the Grecian period. And the little horn plucked 3 horns that came before it. But Antiochus could not uproot 3 kings. Thirdly, it became greater than the other horns. Antiochus was never greater than even the Seleucid kings. He was one of them and one of the weaker kings. No way comparable to this little horn, which became great and stronger than its fellows. The saints were given into the hands of the little horn for a time, times, and half a times, 3.5 times, or 1260 days. But he only suspended the sacrifice in Jerusalem temple for 3 years and 10 days. So even time-wise, it does not fit. So as we see, and many more reasons, that the little horn power cannot be equated to Antiochus. This literal, preterist, or futuristic interpretation does not fit into the biblical scheme of understanding. The vision of chapter 2,300 days, the activities of the little horn, is for the end of times, as we see in verse 17, and reiterated in verse 19, that it pertains to the later time and the appointed end. End is when the little horn, its activities are being carried on, and not in the 2nd century BC. It shall rise at the end of their rule, also in verse 23, and refers to many days in the future in verse 26. So this horn cannot be a Grecian king in the 2nd century, as most Christian scholars believe and interpret. Judgment is to take place that brings little horn to its end. There was no judgment which took place in the 2nd century BC. And its end again of the little horn comes with no human hand. Antiochus died perhaps a natural death or was killed in battle. But this little horn and its end will come with no human hand. Its judgment shall come from heaven, just like the stone that was cut with no human hand in chapter 2, when the kingdoms of this earth will come to an end. And so as we look at the end of chapter 8, we see Gabriel coming to explain to Daniel the vision and its understanding, which we have seen. Yes, my friend, this prophecy has its end not in the 2nd century, but it is in the end of time, and is very strongly mentioned in this chapter. So we should look to the end times when this prophecy will culminate, when all the prophecies of Daniel will come to an end. And when Daniel saw this vision, verse 27, it says, he fainted and he was sick for many days. After which he rose up and went on the king's business, because he was astonished by this vision, but no one could understand. As you see this vision, as it comes to more clearly and in a more finer way, revealing to us the great details of prophetic time and prophetic history, especially of the last days. After these world powers continue their presence, and the little horn carrying on its activities, in chapter 7, against God's people, speaking against the Most High, trying to change times and laws. And in chapter 8, we see the little horn working against the sanctuary and its services, which are basically Christ and his ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. Yes, this power, which came after the Roman power as a religious papal power, papal Rome, pagan Rome that assumed religious powers and carrying on its activities against even Jesus Christ. That is how we see the great controversy raging in this chapter. Why are all these things happening prophetically? Because it is a great controversy that is taking place. God's people will be judged and they will be vindicated little horn power will be brought to an end. But let us be clear, the little horn power is a religio-political power working against God's people, and especially even in these days that we are living today, this power is carrying on its activities. And God's people will be targeted. The ministry of Jesus Christ is brought under attack. But the sanctuary will be cleansed. All these things will come to an end with judgment. But the wonderful assurance is that if we make our decision and our choice to be on the side of God, we can be sure that Christ is there in the heavenly sanctuary as our mediator, as our intercessor, as our judge. And we have nothing to fear because we have made our stand for Jesus. Judgment will be given in favor of us, and we shall receive the kingdom. This is a wonderful assurance that we see in this prophecy of chapter 8. I want to thank you once again for listening patiently. We can spend some time in questions. If you have, we will see that we can find some answers from the Word of God. God bless you all with this wonderful assurance as we spend now some time bringing our study to a close and with some question answers and discussions.